Welcome to ASEAN Insights, Understanding Southeast Asia, the premier podcast that examines current dynamics defining the region. Brought to you by the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, each episode we will talk with thought leaders who are shaping the future of the region through research, policy, activism, or business. This is Lydia Ruddy, the Director of Communications and Special Advisor for U.S. ASEAN Affairs at the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. Today, I spoke with Professor Paul Evans from the University of British Columbia, where he's been teaching Asia and Trans-Pacific International Relations since 1999. Calling himself an Asia-Pacific man, he describes the shift from Asia-Pacific openness to the geopolitical tensions of the Indo-Pacific era. The conversation addresses the rise of techno-nationalism and the impact of the geopolitics on universities and research in general. Good morning, Paul. Thank you so much for joining us here. We're very glad to have you on this podcast.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you after a chance to meet you all in last month.
Yeah, we were very happy to have you in our office. It's one of the first public visits that we've had, and it was great. And I want to follow up on that conversation because it was fascinating what you said. So I really wanted to start with one of the comments that you made that was about the current affairs and the shift from Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific, but you called yourself an Asia-Pacific man. So can you tell us what that means?
The Indo-Pacific era is unfolding in worrisome ways and in turbulent times. At the global level, what has happened with the pandemic and the health and economic implications of it for so many people, what has happened in Ukraine and Russia's war of aggression there has also sent shockwaves through the international system, norms that had been much respected, occasionally violated. But now I think that we're in an Indo-Pacific era in which the basic ingredients of what was there at the end of the Cold War from basically 1990 through to about 2015. Asia-Pacific was an era of optimism. Asia-Pacific was an era of ideas like open regionalism, increased globalization, of cooperative and comprehensive security, about building some kind of inclusive community of economic interests on trade basis, production in a region on both sides of the Pacific Ocean. And it was also about including China and non-like-minded countries. It was a dream. It was not fully realized, but it was that era of optimism and openness and inclusivity. The Indo-Pacific era, which began roughly a decade ago, was the idea that geopolitics and political differences, great power rivalries, were back. They were back with a particular focus on the U.S.-China relationship. That was this openness formula. In the era of Indo-Pacific, there's still some of that, but there is a whole new dimension of what is sometimes called decoupling, where global supply chains, trading systems are being pulled apart on the basis of political and geopolitical differences. This new era of Indo-Pacific is something dramatically different. And it is testing the positions of individual countries. And it is also, I think, leading to a deepening tension between the United States and China. that is moving in a direction that is worrisome for all of us. 10 years ago, political scientists and international relations people in the region really had to listen to the economists. In the Asia-Pacific era, it was the moment of economic rationality, at least the aspiration towards it, towards trying to increase welfare through economics. The era of Indo-Pacific is the era of geopolitics. And economics and economists are having to reformulate what they do in the context of situations where economic rationality is not the name of the game. It is about a power game rather than a prosperity game, at least in many ways.
So economists take heed. And an interesting thing I read in the news this week, that as for the last several months, everyone's been talking about the one area of agreement in Washington, D.C. between both parties is an anti-China sentiment. But there seems to be a fissure forming. Now the Republicans are complaining that most of the China policy is coming out of the Commerce Department. Especially vis-a-vis trade. They want that to come out of the Pentagon. So I'm wondering if you have heard about this or have any thoughts about that.
Well, I think everyone has been struck by the consensus in the United States on a hardening line. And that comes as the definition of China as an existential threat. The premise of the Asia-Pacific era of the inclusion of China, the vast majority of American elites have come to a different view. That China is not just a strategic competitor, but an adversary that needs to be pushed back. And Washington has been lining up with its allies, like-minded, most of those countries that have signed on to Indo-Pacific strategies, to work with it in pushing back against China's rise. That's true. Now, the instruments that are being developed in Washington, there is debate about them. In the Trump era, the principal tool was tariffs and on trade issues. In the late Trump period and in the Biden period, the instrument of choice has been technology. It began with an attack, a restriction on Huawei's activities in the United States, but has spread through dozens of Chinese companies that are now on different kinds of entity and restriction lists. The most recent debate is around TikTok as a Chinese company that is seen as a threat because partly of its technological prowess. But the differences in the United States between those who feel that techno-nationalism, the new pressures on China, should be even stronger, quicker, that in essence, all decisions will be seen through the lens of military advantage made by players that are interested in maximizing American national power. There certainly are those voices. I think that the Biden administration, in general terms, has wanted to decouple, but selectively decouple, to do it on the basis of a blend of economic advantage to all, but also geopolitical advantage to the United States. But the general trend line is towards more geopolitics. And the clearest indicator of it right now is that it is the Commerce Department, not the U.S. Trade Representative, that is behind most of U.S. economic policies towards China. Most of those sanctions, most of those restrictions, these are not being traded. These are being enforced. And that's the Commerce Department's game. Now, maybe in future, it is going to be even a heavier Pentagon voice, a heavier, but for the moment, I would say focus attention on what American intentions are, what American instruments are, focus it on the Commerce Department.
You mentioned techno-nationalism, and this whole shutting down of the connections between China and the rest of the world for technical development purposes. How should ASEAN be preparing for this?
Let me take a step back and talk about this idea of techno-nationalism, because techno-nationalism is fundamentally the idea that goods, products, services need to be looked at through the lens of national security. Now, we've had since the beginning of the invention of the wheel, states have tried to monopolize the advantages of new technologies. But in the modern era, techno-nationalism was a common game. What's happened now in the era of techno-nationalism is that the United States, to some extent China, are viewing economic relations, commercial relations, through the lens of national economic advantage and military advantage. Usually techno-nationalism used to be about military use and dual use. In the Indo-Pacific era, techno-nationalism is also about economic advantage, holding on to key sectors of an economy that will produce value. Artificial intelligence, of telecommunications, quantum computing. These are areas that will have military significance. But most importantly, they're going to have commercial significance. The industries of the fourth industrial revolution run on data, run on technologies that are fundamentally transformational. And it's the definition of several sectors as those transformative technologies that is now the area of competition. It is not just between the United States and China. There's companies involved. There's global supply chains. But those are the two countries that have the capability to define and develop whole sectors of economies. Techno-nationalism is a force pulling apart economic integration and supply chains. And that has serious consequences. As the United States is building its relationships with other countries, the Biden administration wants others to buy into the new techno-nationalist competition. But I think the real calculation, and where economists are going to be so important, is underlining the tremendous economic costs to the pulling apart of supply chains, the enormous economic costs of techno-nationalism. I mean, you have IMF doing predictions that if techno-nationalism and decoupling is pulling apart of the supply chains, that it will cost 6% of world GDP growth. I mean, it's the money that is involved in this. When you start pulling supply chains apart, when you start ripping apart the networks of university researchers and teams, when you rip apart the production facilities, even moving one fabrication plant for those high-end semiconductor chips, that is a $15 to $20 billion investment. And there is little indication that it will increase profitability and, in fact, will reduce it by cutting out of the system the world's largest market, which is China, the manufacturer. So, Lydia, I think the issue that we're having to think through now is what could be the long-term, even the medium-term consequences of some of this, and where should we position? How far should Japan and South Korea, the Canadas, the France, the United Kingdom, and the countries of Southeast Asia, how far should they participate in pushing back against China in an Indo-Pacific era? How far should they get on this bandwagon? Or is it possible to get on it for a couple of narrow purposes, but not ride that train to its final destination? Many of us are most worried that 5 years ago we could have seen maybe a few restricted sectors where there really did need to be some divorce, some cutting off. Now, the number of sectors that are being discussed are so enormous that it is the path to a more comprehensive decoupling. The countries in Southeast Asia and many of the leaders in Korea and Japan and elsewhere would like to maintain open trading systems and multilateral rules, not the kind of arrangement that is pulled by the United States.
And I want to go back to something you said a few minutes ago about the costs of the decoupling. So at one point you spoke about, during our conversation in the office, about some research that you're doing tracking 23, I think it was 23 elements. Is that related to the impact and the costs? And if so, can you say something about that? And secondly, the impact on universities or think tanks and research institutions of all of this?
Well, the challenge in the contemporary era is that technology is behind and beneath almost all of the areas of innovation that are taking place in economies. And we've been doing a look at some 23 sectors that have been identified by Canadian intelligence agencies as potentially sensitive sectors that will advance the interests of foreign countries more than they will advance Canadian and our allies' interests. In other words, there are areas that are on the screen of concern about Chinese research in Canada, about research exchanges with Canada involving Chinese, and involving student flows in those areas. So it is a whole range of sectors that are under the techno-nationalist microscope now. And Canada hasn't moved in the same way that the United States has, as quickly in restricting and in fact closing many of those connections. For example, with Huawei. Canada still does a little bit of research business with it. But there are all of those sectors where that's happening. And why it matters in universities is that universities create knowledge based on the needs of their particular nation. But they're also in a global game, trying to contribute to global health, to dealing with global environment issues, to dealing with new materials that might help people walk better. It has evolved into a global game, scientific research. The number of research collaborations between Chinese and Americans is greater than between Americans and any other country. Now, when you start then down the path of geopolitics, the path of techno-nationalism, and you decide that those technologies in many areas are fundamental, you start restricting them. In the United States, those restrictions have come through blanket bans about a company like Huawei, where Americans who do research or work with Huawei are potentially susceptible to criminal charges. They certainly are not going to get any funding from the American government. And some of them, as there have been, some 70 American professors facing criminal charges because of their interactions with Chinese institutions. Here in Canada, if you're a scientist and you're applying for research that has a private sector partner in another country, especially China, before you can get federal government funding, you have to do a special risk assessment, which says what is the sector you're working in with this Chinese company? Is it a risk to Canadian national security? And now in Canada too, national security is being defined not just as military or dual use, but fundamental economic advantage to Canada. And so that what goes on in a research lab at a university or in a classroom where Chinese students are being brought in, you have to look at that interaction through the lens of national security. This is something new for our professors, but they're getting used to it pretty quickly.
So the impact is obviously way beyond economics and hits the environment, climate change, medical advancements. It's scary. So I want to end with a shift to the future. And what do you think is in store for us? And are there any sort of bright spots that we can steer ourselves towards?
Well, at this moment of comparative gloom in the Indo-Pacific era, it's pretty easy to see a slippery slope, not just into economic decoupling, but military interactions in the region. This is with defense spending increasing, new anxiety around the Taiwan issue, South China Sea issue. These have been issues that have been around for a while, but there is a new edge to them. And I think the reason there is an edge to them is because in past, we worked on the assumption that economic interdependence was good economically, but it was good geopolitically too, that it reduced tensions or at least made conflict less likely. We've all known that nations go to war, that they use military instruments, but when you have deep economic integration, when you have those kinds of connections that were the defining feature of that Asia-Pacific era, when you had them, they made conflict less likely. Well, when those economic connections fray, there is anxiety, there is worry. And I think the question then comes, is there anything that outsiders, Southeast Asians, Canadians, Europeans can do, but can the rest of us try to find ways to first maintain multilateral trading rules? How can we strengthen organizations like the World Trade Organization, the IMF, various regional structures that are open multilateralist processes? There's an agenda there that we can double down on and some indication that there may be possible successes. How can we try to limit the scope, the definition of those sectors that are seen as key to national security? What can we do in our research labs, in the rules that we develop in other countries, not to see everything as a national security issue in an existential competition with China? And I'd say finally, one of the things that is going to be difficult, but is really essential, almost every country in the region has anxieties about China. It has anxieties about some of its domestic political repression, human rights issues, but also its territorial pressures and pushes. The South China Sea, the East China Sea, everyone has a set of concerns about China. But how we can frame restraining China in those areas as compared to a pushback against the Chinese economy. In other words, how can we how can we be selective in pushing back against China without treating it as an existential threat? Most countries want to deal with the United States. Most countries want to deal with China. And I think the intellectual battle is to indicate those many sectors where cooperation with China is not just necessary, but valuable, economically profitable, but also as a way of advancing global science, as a way of helping deal with some kinds of production problems that can help us with future pandemics, et cetera. So in other words, I think the fundamental issue is how far to see China as a challenge, but not as an existential threat.
And on that positive note, I want to thank you for joining today. This has been a really interesting conversation.
I hope we'll have chances to talk again in future.
We look forward to seeing you back here as well. Have a good evening.
Good night.
Good night.
If you have any questions about the issues explored in this episode, email us at contactus@iria.org. If you enjoyed this episode, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other streaming platforms so that you will be notified about future sessions.